They look thirsty! Well, let's give them something to drink!
You know the Spartans as the ultimate warriors. Bronze shields, blood-red cloaks, and abs that could stop arrows. They were the guys who laughed at death and made their enemies wet themselves, just by showing up. But here's something that would blow your mind. These same Spartans, the most feared warriors in the ancient world, lived every single day in absolute terror of one group of people. Not the Persians with their million-man armies, not the Athenians with their clever strategies. The Spartans were scared senseless of their own slaves. Yeah, you heard that right. The people who made This Is Sparta. Famous were constantly looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, and sleeping with one eye open because of the Helots. The enslaved population they had created and now couldn't control. Helots are a walking nightmare. Not just forced labor, but a constant threat etched into every Spartan's life. These weren't people who had been captured in distant wars and dragged back to Sparta in chains. The Helots were Greeks, just like the Spartans, who had been conquered and enslaved in their own homeland. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and had the same burning desire for freedom that drove Spartan warriors into battle. But what's shocking is that these Helots outnumbered their Spartan masters by 7-1. Every single Spartan citizen was surrounded by 7 people who wanted them dead, and had every reason to make it happen. That's like being the only person in a room full of people who hate your guts and know exactly where you sleep at night. The story of how the Spartans created their own worst nightmare starts back in the 8th century BC with the Messenian Wars. Sparta needed farmland and resources, so they looked west to Messenia, a wealthy region with fertile soil and prosperous cities. What should have been a normal war of conquest turned into something much darker and more twisted. When the Spartans finally conquered Messenia after decades of brutal warfare, they made a decision that would haunt them for centuries, instead of doing what most ancient conquerors did, such as killing the men, taking the women and children as slaves, and resettling the land with their own people. The Spartans decided to keep the entire Messenian population as slaves on their own land. The origins of the Helots go back to the Messenian Wars, a series of conflicts in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. During these wars, Sparta, who needed farmland and resources, invaded Messenia, which was a wealthy region to their west. It was undeniably cruel, but strategically brilliant. The Spartans had just created a massive population of people who knew the land better than they did, who had strong reasons to hate them, and who vastly outnumbered them. The Helots weren't scattered across the Greek world where they might forget their homeland and accept their fate. They were right there, working the same fields their ancestors had owned, living in the shadows of the cities where they had once been free citizens. Every day they woke up and saw the mountains and valleys of their homeland ruled by foreign conquerors. Every day they were reminded of what they had lost and who had taken it from them. The Spartans quickly realized they had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to fix it. The Helots were the foundation of Spartan society. They grew the food, built the houses, and did all the work that kept Sparta running. Without Helot labor, the Spartan citizens couldn't spend their time training for war. But with Helot labor came Helot rage, and that rage was about to explode. The first major Helot revolt took place around 665 BC and is known as the Second Messenian War. The Helots seized on the occasion of Sparta's defeat by Argos at the Battle of Hysiae to launch a revolt. The Helots were organized, determined, and they knew how to fight. Many of them were the sons and grandsons of Messenian warriors who had fought against Sparta in the original conquest. This first major revolt lasted for years and nearly destroyed Sparta. The Helots had the numbers. They knew the terrain, and they had nothing to lose. They turned the beautiful valleys of Messenia into a war zone, burning Spartan farms, killing Spartan settlers, and forcing the Spartan army to fight a guerrilla war against people who could disappear into the mountains and reappear anywhere. The Spartans barely won that war, and the experience left them permanently traumatized. They had gotten a taste of what their own slaves could do when they organized and fought back, and it terrified them. From that moment on, controlling the Helots became the single most important task of the Spartan state. Owing to their own numerical inferiority, the Spartans were always preoccupied with the fear of a Helot revolt. The ephors of each year on entering office declared war on the Helots, so that they might be murdered at any time without violating religious scruples. Think about that for a second. Every year, the Spartan government officially declared war on its own slave population. Not because the Helots had done anything wrong, but because the Spartans needed legal cover to murder them whenever they felt like it. This was a rational response to a genuinely terrifying situation. The Helots outnumbered their masters by some 7-1. In a society where every adult male was a trained warrior, being outnumbered 7-1 by people who hated you was a recipe for disaster. The Spartans knew that if the Helots ever got organized and united, they could wipe out the entire Spartan population in a matter of days. So, the Spartans did what they always did when faced with a military problem. They got creative with violence. They created one of the most terrifying institutions in ancient history, the Cryptia. This operated far beyond a typical secret police force. It functioned as a state-backed terror machine meant to keep the Helots under control. The Cryptia was an ancient Spartan state institution. The Cryptii either principally sought out and killed Helots across Laconia and Messenia as part of a policy of terrorizing and intimidating the enslaved population. The Cryptia was made up of the best and brightest young Spartan men, usually those who had just completed their military training. These were rogues or criminals and were also the cream of Spartan society who were handpicked for their intelligence, physical ability, and absolute loyalty to the state. Their job was simple: hunt down and kill Helots whenever and wherever they found them. But in the night, they came down to the roads and killed every Helot whom they caught. Often, too, they actually made their way across fields where the Helots were working and killed the sturdiest and best of them. The Cryptia didn't kill random Helots. They specifically targeted the strongest, smartest, and most independent-minded ones. Anyone who showed leadership potential, anyone who stood out from the crowd, anyone who might inspire others to rebel, was marked for death. The members of the Cryptia would disappear into the countryside for weeks at a time, living rough and moving at night. They were given no support, no backup, and no resources except their weapons and their training. They had to survive on their own while hunting human beings through the mountains and forests of Messenia and Laconia. They also would often make excursions into the fields where they found the strongest and most independently minded Helots and murder them also. During the day, they would hide in caves or abandoned buildings, watching Helot communities and identifying their targets. At night, they would strike without warning, killing their victims silently and disappearing back into the darkness. This was systematic murder designed to terrorize an entire population. The Helots never knew when or where the Cryptia would strike next. A Helot could be working in the fields one day and found dead the next morning, with no witnesses and no explanation. The message was clear: no Helot was safe, no matter how obedient or how useful they might be. The psychological impact of Cryptia was devastating. The Helots lived in constant fear, knowing that showing any sign of strength or independence could be a death sentence. They couldn't trust their neighbors, couldn't plan for the future, and couldn't even grieve their dead without risking being marked as troublemakers themselves. But the Cryptia wasn't about terrorizing the Helots. It was also about training the next generation of Spartan warriors. The young men who joined the Cryptia learned skills that no amount of regular military training could teach them. They learned to survive in hostile territory, to move silently through enemy terrain, to kill without hesitation, and to live with the constant threat of death. More importantly, they learned to see the Helots not as human beings, but as dangerous animals that needed to be kept under control. This psychological conditioning was essential for maintaining the Spartan system. Every Spartan citizen had to be willing to kill Helots without mercy, and the Cryptia made sure they developed that willingness early. The terror tactics worked, but they also created a vicious cycle. The more the Spartans oppressed the Helots, the more the Helots hated them. The more the Helots hated them, the more the Spartans feared them. The more the Spartans feared them, the more brutal their oppression became. Each generation of Helots grew up with more reasons to rebel, and each generation of Spartans grew up with more reasons to be afraid. Yes, there was a very large Helot revolt following an earthquake in 465 BCE. It was a very large revolt, and the Spartans asked Athens for help. This revolt shows just how terrified the Spartans were of their own slaves. When an earthquake hit Sparta in 465 BC, the Helots saw their chance and launched a massive uprising. The Spartans, who had never asked for help from anyone, were so desperate that they called on their rivals in Athens for military assistance. The revolt lasted for several years and nearly brought down the Spartan state. The Helots had learned from their previous failures and were better organized than ever before. They fortified positions in the mountains and fought a guerrilla war that the Spartan army struggled to counter. The Spartans, who were used to fighting pitched battles against other Greek armies, found themselves completely out of their element against an enemy that refused to meet them in open combat. The Spartans feared that the democratically inclined Athenian soldiers might decide to help the Helots, who were fellow Greeks, escape from Spartan domination. When the Athenian army finally arrived to help, the Spartans took one look at them and sent them home. They were so paranoid about Helot rebellion that they were afraid their own allies might side with the slaves against them. This decision had massive consequences for Greek history. The Athenians were insulted by being dismissed after coming to help, and the incident contributed to the breakdown of the alliance between Sparta and Athens that eventually led to the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans were so afraid of their own slaves that they were willing to insult their most powerful ally, rather than risk having foreign soldiers see how badly the Helots wanted to be free. The Helots were an economic and social nightmare that poisoned every aspect of Spartan life. Spartan citizens couldn't travel freely in their own territory because they might be ambushed by Helots seeking revenge. They couldn't leave their families unguarded because Helot servants might decide to settle old scores. They couldn't even trust the people who cooked their food and cared for their children. The Spartan army's primary function was to suppress Helot revolts and maintain control over their numbers rather than stopping invaders or engaging in military conquests. The famous Spartan military machine, which we remember for its victories against the Persians and other Greek states, was actually designed primarily to fight their own slaves. The Spartan army was built to keep the Helots from conquering Sparta. This had massive implications for Spartan foreign policy. The Spartans were notoriously conservative in their military adventures, rarely sending large armies far from home. They couldn't afford to send their warriors away for long campaigns because they needed those warriors at home to guard against Helot uprisings. Every time Sparta went to war, they had to weigh the military benefits against the risk of leaving their homeland vulnerable to Helot rebellion. Every time they won a victory abroad, they had to worry about whether the Helots might see it as an opportunity to strike. The Helots had turned Sparta into a prison where the guards were just as trapped as the prisoners. The Spartans tried everything they could think of to solve their Helot problem. They offered freedom to Helots who served bravely in the military, hoping to create a class of loyal ex-slaves who would help keep the others in line. They tried dividing the Helots against each other, promoting some to overseer positions and giving them small privileges. They even tried mass murder on a scale that would make serial killers jealous. There are allusions to what can only be called covert assassinations, blatantly overt assassinations, and the implied mass murder of liberated Helots. According to some sources, the Spartans once freed 2,000 Helots who had served with distinction in the military, then promptly murdered all of them in secret. The message was clear. There was no way for Helots to earn their freedom, no matter how loyal they might be. But nothing worked. The Helots kept rebelling, kept resisting, and kept reminding the Spartans that their entire way of life was built on a foundation of sand. The Spartans had created a system that required constant violence to maintain, and that violence was eating away at their souls just as much as it was oppressing their slaves. The psychological cost of living in constant fear was enormous. Spartan citizens couldn't enjoy their privileged position because they were always looking over their shoulders. They couldn't form normal relationships with their servants because those servants might be planning to kill them. They couldn't even sleep peacefully because they never knew if they would wake up to find their house on fire and their family murdered. The Helots had turned the tables on their masters in the most fundamental way possible. The Spartans had tried to make the Helots live in fear, but instead, they had created a situation where everyone was afraid. The masters were just as trapped by the system as the slaves, just as damaged by the violence, and just as unable to escape the cycle of hatred and revenge. The irony is that the Spartans had created exactly the kind of enemy they were supposedly trained to fight. The Helots were brave, disciplined, and willing to die for their cause. They were organized, experienced in warfare, and absolutely committed to their goal of freedom. They were, in many ways, the perfect Spartan warriors, except they were fighting against Sparta instead of for it. The Helots weren't just an external threat that the Spartans could defeat and move on from. They were an internal cancer that was slowly destroying Spartan society from within. Every act of oppression created more hatred. Every act of violence created more desire for revenge. Every generation of Helots who grew up in slavery was more determined to fight back than the one before. The Spartans had trapped themselves in a system that required them to be monsters to survive. They had to murder children to prevent future rebellions. They had to terrorize innocent people to maintain order. They had to live in constant fear of the very people they claimed to control. The Helots had turned their masters into the very thing they claimed to despise. Cowards who could only maintain their position through violence and terror. Unsuccessful Helot rebellions would often result in the killing or torture of the Helots who were involved. But the successful suppression of Helot rebellions only made the problem worse. Each failed revolt was followed by brutal reprisals that created more martyrs and more reasons for the next generation to rebel. The Spartans were caught in a trap of their own making, forced to become more brutal with each passing year just to maintain the status quo. The Helots were the ghosts of Sparta's past mistakes, the living embodiment of everything wrong with Spartan society. They were proof that the Spartan system wasn't based on honor or military excellence, but on the systematic oppression of other human beings. It was the truth that Spartan propaganda tried to hide. The famous Spartan warriors were just bullies who could only maintain their position by terrorizing people who couldn't fight back. The most terrifying thing about the Helots was their patience. They could wait decades for the right moment to strike. They could endure years of oppression while quietly preparing for rebellion. They could smile at their masters while planning their murders. They had learned to play the long game, and they were better at it than the Spartans ever were. The Helots taught the Spartans a lesson that no amount of military training could prepare them for. Creating enemies is easy, but controlling them is impossible. The Spartans had turned an entire population into their mortal enemies, and no amount of violence or terror could change that fact. The Helots would always be there, always waiting, always ready to strike when the moment was right. The Spartans created their own nightmare, and they had to live with it every single day until their civilization finally collapsed. The Helots were the price of Spartan glory, the dark secret behind their military success, and the ultimate proof that no society built on oppression can last forever. They were the tribe that even the mighty Spartans feared, and they were right to be afraid. So the next time you hear someone talking about how tough and disciplined the Spartans were, remember what that discipline actually meant. Remember that their famous warrior culture was built on the systematic terrorization of innocent people. Remember that their military excellence came from the constant fear of their own slaves rising up and slaughtering them all. The Spartans were cowards who could only maintain their position through violence and murder. They created a system so brutal and unsustainable that it eventually destroyed them completely. The Helots outlasted their masters, and in the end, that's all that really matters.